Greek temple is part of the landscape. It appears suddenly, is detached with difficulty from its surroundings, but then unmistakable. The color and texture of the stone is beautiful, not only for its patina of ancient brilliance, but for its worth as sheer building material. The worked stone from neighboring quarries seems to spring from the soil, the texture of its surface as varied as the changing landscape. Light limestone from Salinas in Sicily, earthy brown, sun-soaked from nearby Agrigento. Hard gray from the Peloponnesian mountains. White, wind-scoured marble of Sunium. Honey-colored travertine of Paestum. Pentelic marble with the waxen red patina of oxidized iron. Coarse ashen-gray shell conglomerate of Olympia. But this mineral magic of stone conjures up no vision of the temple in its pristine state. It is in truth a ruin. Altus, the sacred grove at Olympia, is neatly revealed here by the excavator's spade. The foundations and remnants of temples, altars, treasure houses, and away from the center, the training quarters and stadium of the Olympic athletes. That famous writer of guidebooks, Pausanias, visited Olympia about 170 A.D. His descriptions throw a contemporary light upon the excavations and dramatize the vigorous life cycle of this Greek power center. The great temple of Zeus, finished in 456 B.C., was the central point not only of Olympia, but of the whole of Greece. It had been standing for 700 years when Pausanias saw it in the days of Marcus Aurelius and the 238th Olympiad. But it was not the architecture that attracted Pausanias. He was more interested in historical anecdotes. He tells us of a workshop studio of Phidias, the tall shed-like building in the foreground of the model, in which Phidias worked on a statue of the enthroned Zeus, and where the actual foundations were recently discovered. But surrounded by the later richly constructed and reconstructed buildings, visitors' lodgings, administrative offices, training quarters for athletes, and the covered tracks of the gymnasium, the marble-roofed temple of Zeus always dominated the scene. Next to it, with a low-tiled roof, stretched out the ancient, honored temple of Hera. The temple of Zeus is the norm of the Doric form, a model in measurement and all other respects for what was to follow. The temple of Hera, a century and a half older, had been gradually transformed from a wooden building to one of stone. We must visualize the walls of what is known as the cella, that is, the inner chamber of the temple, as a half-timbered construction fitted with mud brick on a foundation of stone. Originally, the roof supports and beams were of wood, and so were the columns, only replaced one by one as necessity or tradition demanded by columns of stone. The columns of the Hera temple were about 20 feet high. Those of the Zeus temple near 40. The platform of the temple, the three great steps leading up to it, the capitals with their supporting slab, the lion-headed water spouts of marble, all speak to us even now with a concentrated power that must have moved the worshippers of that time. The front of the temple, with its 6 columns, proclaims classical order. Behind the facade stands the entrance to the cella, the home of the statue of the god, a seated, wood-carved figure covered with ivory and gold, looming 40 feet high, filling the area with majesty. It ranked as one of the 7 wonders of the world, although later objections were raised that the god would have lifted the roof off if he had decided to rise from his throne. All that remains is his picture on ancient coins, a truly godlike head. There were many other statues in front of the temple. Pausanias busily counted 24 bronze statues of Zeus alone. He tells us also of an altar outside the temple, a mountain created from the ashes of burnt offerings, growing higher and higher through the centuries. The altar belonged to the temple, but since all sacrificial acts took place under the open sky, the temple itself contained nothing but the shrine of the god. Naples, 23rd March, 1787. Goethe wrote in the diary of his Italian journey, "We had been uncertain whether our journey would take us through rocks or ruins, when at last some long rectangular masses we had already noticed from afar revealed themselves as the remains of temples." For centuries, the temples at Paestum had been lost to all knowledge in a marshy, malaria-infested, scrub-covered coastal plain. They were discovered in the middle of the 18th century when the road to the south was constructed, just at the right time when interest in archaeology was becoming fashionable. While Goethe's traveling companion, the painter Knip, immediately took to his sketchbook, Goethe wondered about the ruins. To him, the blunt, thickly set mass of columns appeared terrifying. It took him some time to bring his concept of classicism to terms with what he actually saw. The romantic awareness of beauty in ruins, the sense of discovery, the enthusiastic copying of Greek art in Goethe's time, or our modern subjective photographic vision, neither can bring us close to what the Greeks saw as they stood before their temples, unless we stand there ourselves, perhaps, leaving preconceptions behind us. The Temple of Hera in Paestum expresses the Doric temple in its classical development. Its ruins are better preserved than others, and in them we can read the canon of Doric form. 3 steps alone, not scaled to the measure of a human stride, form the substructure from which the columns rise. Each shaft has carved, sharp-edged fluting. The column tapers as it rises. The curve of the capital, the echinus, literally sea urchin, carries the abacus, the square slab at the top, supporting the horizontal architrave, which connects the vertical columns. The architrave is the lowest part of the entablature, a single, uninterrupted band. Above it, there's a second layer of a row of triglyphs, that is, blocks with triple vertical grooves. One of these is placed centrally above each column, another halfway between. The intervals between the triglyphs form roughly square fields, the metopes. Thus, the interval between 2 columns is cut in half by the triglyphs, and the rhythm is doubled, and paradoxically shortened. The cornice, the projecting ledge of the sloping roof, carries underneath a series of blocks, the mutules, which again have the intervals between column, triglyph, column. Thus, to each interval between the columns below, there are 4 intervals above. The rhythm is speeded up once again. These blocks beneath the cornice, the mutules, and the projections underneath the triglyphs are studded with cylindrical pegs, the guttae. They presumably imitate the wooden pegs used in carpentry when temples were built of wood. Vitruvius, in his book on architecture, derived many details of form in the Greek temple from the earlier constructions of wood. He considers the alternation of triglyph and metope in the Doric temple to be a result of the earlier structure of wooden beams, with gaps or eyes between them. These open eyes were eventually blocked in with panels, the metopes, which carried pictorial decoration, while the beam ends were covered with carved panels, the 3-grooved triglyphs. When temples came to be built of stone, nothing structural corresponded anymore to triglyph and metope. They became decoration. But this tenacious adherence to traditional form, originally religious in nature, brought with it architectural complications at the corners of the temple. A triglyph had to be set at each corner of the entablature. It offered a visual termination and had been a structural necessity when the temple was made of wood, for the triglyph then marked the head of the beam, coming in at each corner at right angles. But the pattern of horizontal metope and vertical triglyph, when applied to stone, which has a broader construction than wood, left only part of the metope at the corner, a condition which was plainly intolerable and had to be straightened out. This could be done either by making the corner metopes broader or by shortening the interval between the columns at the corner. There were many possible variations between these extremes, and the problem was solved by each architect in his own way. The top of the temple consisted of the pediment, its raking cornices, and the guttering or the pegging, formerly called the cyma. The Temple of Hera has lost its cyma and also the figural decoration, which explains why the roof seems flat and rather squat. We must think of it as having been luxuriantly ornamented, as a crown to the whole building. The vertical open screen of the colonnade is contained between the strong horizontal lines of substructure below and entablature above. At Paestum, as at Olympia, next to the developed classical temple, an earlier one stands, or rather sprawls, with 18 columns at the side and 9 in the front. Even if, in our imagination, we restored the cella, the inner chamber of the temple, whose stone blocks were stolen and used for other neighboring buildings, there remains with us an impression of spreading heaviness, a lack of concentrated tension. The ancestors of these columns were tree trunks. It's easy to believe that from the distance they appear quite slender, but under their immediate shadow we sense a brooding massiveness. The column shaft stands on a broad surface. Under the load of the superstructure, it swells like a muscled arm. The curve of the capital appears to bulge between the column shaft below and the square abacus above. The heavy burden is drastically, naively evident. The decorative border between shaft and capital is carved with incredible delicacy compared to the brute force expressed by the columns, a bracelet with ever-changing ornamentation. The columns of the older temple are 22 feet high, 20 slim flutes, and then the bursting tautness of the massive shaft. The columns of the classic temple are almost 30 feet high, and in relation to the weight they carry, seem much more compact. But the 24 deep flutes act like a tight-laced corset. In the older temple, the curved capital was rather like a cushion pressed flat. Here it burgeons powerfully out of the shaft to meet the load of the architrave. A series of carved rings is the only decoration of the classic Doric capital. The columns are now so closely set against each other that the abaci practically touch and give the illusion of a continuous wall. The Temple of Zeus at Olympia is structured according to the classic plan, in harmonious design, visible from all sides, each dimension in proportion to all others. The ground plan is basically that of the Hera Temple at Paestum, and the architectural variables are naturally similar. The Doric column, for example, cannot be arbitrarily stretched or shortened. The colonnade of the cella must therefore be constructed in 2 stories. The 2 rows of columns are erected in proportion each to another in size and in the number of flutes, the lower colonnade 20, the upper 16, so that the upper colonnade naturally continues the tapering of the lower one without losing its entasis, that is, the gentle swelling of the shaft, which gives individual movement to each column. Horizontal forms in the classic temples always show a subtle swelling. The verticals incline inward. The tension created by these tiny deviations from the straight line, giving life and movement to the whole building, is hardly visible to the eye. Measurement alone proves its existence. The transition from the archaic to the classic temple can be compared to contemporary development in Greek sculpture. We can see that this archaic boy has his weight naively, rigidly poised on both legs. The later classic concept is counterpoise. The hips tilt up to the downturned shoulders, an interplay of movement and counter-movement, giving to the body, calm and relaxed to all outward appearance, an inner tension communicating itself to every limb. The Temple of Hera at Paestum shows only the structural frame, the load and load-bearing elements. The Hephaistos Temple, poised above the Agora of Athens, is the only one sufficiently preserved to show the cella as a solid, three-dimensional object within the open screen of the colonnade. If one ignores the misleading shafts of light entering where they should not, one can visualize dark shadows of solid background behind the pillars. Something is still missing from the picture we're trying to create. The crowning cyma, the guttering, the light-colored stucco which once covered the limestone, and above all, the colors. Above there was the cyma of painted terracotta, the acroteria, the waterspouts, and the antefixes. The horizontal elements on the entablature were colored red, the underside of the cornice, the row of guttae, the pegs, and the tinea, the continuous fillet below the triglyphs. The vertical elements were in blue, that is, the mutules underneath the cornice, the triglyphs, and the continuation of the triglyphs, the ledges under the tinea. This is how the waterspouts of the Sicilian temple in Himera looked when they were first excavated, but the colors have gradually faded as they were exposed to the air. These waterspouts and antefixes from the archaic temple at Thermos indicate how strong and brilliant the colors must have been. Itos is a Greek word for the eagle. Itos is also the term used by Greek masons for the pediment of the temple. The pedimental field allowed room for contemporary artists to express the spirit of the people in full public view. This small, excavated clay model of a house with a gabled roof and two posts in front might well be the forerunner of the Greek temple. The pediment is open, perhaps allowing the smoke to escape. The earliest decoration to adorn this house would have been an ornamental fixture to protect it. A mask of the hideous Gorgon Medusa. The main beam of the house would be protected against the damp, the evil spirits kept at bay. In one of the temples of Selinus, the entire colored terracotta revetment of the pediment was a setting for the Gorgon mask. The Temple of Artemis on the island of Corfu is the earliest stone temple experts have been able to reconstruct. Its 8 front columns support the earliest sculptural pediment of a monumental size, 54 feet long. In the center, the Gorgon Medusa, some 10 feet tall, a grotesque face with tongue outstretched and teeth bared. Snakes twine through her hair and belt her waist. She seems to stride along, wings outspread, wings on her boots, and flanked by 2 enormous panthers. Myth has it that whoever gazes at the Gorgon is turned to stone. The mask placed on the roof beam or set up as a pedimental figure wards off evil and the bringers of evil. Figures belonging to the Gorgon myth are added in small scale to this heraldically balanced composition. The angles of the pediment present a problem and a challenge for the artist. Within the natural, practical limitations of this triangle, certain archetypal statements can be made without deviation from an immediate subject. Here is a king or god enthroned, a spear point directed against him. A reclining figure, presumably a fallen warrior, is pushed into a corner, but the angle of a pediment is perfect for indicating the position of defeat. In the right corner stands Zeus with a thunderbolt in his hand. He's fighting a titan or giant. The size of the figure seems to bear no relation to the importance of the event. There's just no more room in the corner. The whole composition, carved in yellowish limestone, was once resplendent with strong colors, to some modern eyes perhaps even garish in quality. Amidst the debris of the Persian destruction of archaic temples on the Acropolis, a number of sculptures in porous limestone have been found which speak to us yet in something akin to their original color. Two lions are attacking a bull. This has been reconstructed as the centerpiece of a pedimental composition some 55 feet wide, and if two other groups have been rightly identified as belonging to it, they have been cleverly used to fill in the sides. On the left is the scaly body of Nereus, one of the old sea gods. Hercules needed his advice to find the way to the Garden of the Hesperides. Nereus was unwilling, so Hercules wrestled with the slippery ancient and forced him to disgorge his reply. The right corner is filled with a curious winged trio, hard to identify. Three snaky coils are inextricably entwined. Three bodies and three bearded faces with large eyes full of humor. Greek mythology is full of such changeable, many-sided creatures between Olympus and Tartarus, but not always so friendly. The temple of Apphia, the unseen goddess, on the island of Aegina, was begun about 510 BC, some 70 or 80 years after the archaic temples erected at Corfu and on the Acropolis, but 50 years before the temple of Zeus at Olympia. It lies among wind-tugged pines on an almost inaccessible hill, this temple. Its huddled columns seem too numerous for their task. They're not grouped to contain anything, but to form, 32 outside, 24 within, an articulated shape of their own, a three-dimensional sculpture, the sum of its own parts. The limestone was covered with light-colored stucco of marble dust. The colors of the entablature must have been dark blue for the vertical elements, bright red for the horizontal. On the floor of the cella, traces have been found of red plaster. On the roof ridge at the top of the temple, there was once a tall acroterial group. The composition on this pediment was framed against a background of blue, to mirror the intense sapphire blue of the sea. Hair, clothing, and weapons were all in vivid colors. Only the bare alabaster skin was left in natural marble. The figures from which the color has now disappeared are preserved in the Munich Glyptothek, and the grouping has been rearranged in the light of modern research. The theme of both subjects, the wild fighting before Troy. Athena is appropriately in the center, unapproachable in her Olympian calm. On either side rages the violent surge of battle, penetrating the very corners of the pediment and perfectly adapted to the contracting angles. Never before this time had marble been so masterfully worked, nor movement through knowledge of anatomy so exciting. In the west pediment, the bodies of the warriors have been released from the structural rigidity of the archaic period, but their faces still gleam with that empty smile, in a convention often meaningless to us, giving to the group a touch of pantomime. The east pediment was carved about 20 years later. The modern reconstruction has been changed and corrected several times with the progress of archaeological studies. The composition here is freer, has more movement, is no longer narrowly confined to the space in the pediment. The faces have lost their frozen look and reflect what is happening. One can see awareness coming into being. Hercules lets fly an arrow. The head of the Nemean lion serves in his helmet. From the older west pediment, a dying warrior pulls an arrow from his breast. The act alone indicates the tragedy. He lies fallen in battle, with no true bodily heaviness, his face still lit up in a smile, each lock of hair in place as though he accepts death without paying attention to it. This is archaic art. The warrior from the later East pediment really collapses. The heavy limbs contort and twist the body in counterpoise around a central axis. The crossover point between these two conceptions lies somewhere between the first and second pediments of Aegina within the first quarter of the 5th century BC, and somewhere between the childhood and adulthood of a people. Apollo, 10 feet tall, is the center of the west pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. To the right and left, centaurs, guests at a wedding feast given by the Lapiths, their cousins, lay hands in a drunken, lewd brawl on their host womenfolk and pretty boys. This animal eruption must be brought into line. Civilization triumphs. This is one of the great battles in mythology, shown repeatedly in Greek sculpture and painting, each time a fresh study in movement and physical conflict. Yet hardly had this free and naturalistic approach to the human body been achieved when a new reality, the severe style, takes over. The face is now scarcely affected by the turmoil, relaxed, thoughtful, serious, a little sad, but not in the archaic mode. The classical type has come into being, the balance of immediate and eternal truth, so much admired by later generations as ancient marbles. The pediment had no observable function as a load carrier, nor had the metopes between the triglyphs. They were just panels covering an empty space, and they were used in Doric architecture for pictorial decoration. The earliest temples had painted metopes of fired terracotta. A plaque from the Apollo temple at Thermos shows Perseus, who had slain the Gorgon Medusa and is running away from her sisters. He has hidden the Gorgon's head in a satchel to escape its dreaded gaze. The artist chose it peeping out. The earliest metopes of stone are found on archaic buildings in Selinus and Paestum in the middle of the 6th century BC. The metope, like the triangular space of the pediment, presents a challenge to the artist. Here, Europa is carried off by the bull. The scene has to fit the rectangular, almost square frame and fill it. The deeds of Hercules and other heroes are well suited for a sequence of metopes. Hercules seizes the tripod of the Delphic priestess. Each story is complete in itself. Hercules brings the Erymanthian boar to King Eurystheus. The king hides in the Pythos, a storage vat. Hercules versus the giant Antaios. The Cercopes were twin pygmies, well-known cheats and swindlers. Hercules caught them disguised as bluebottles, spoiling his sleep. He hung them like meat from a pole. We meet this story in Paestum and a little later in Selinus. The twins, seeing Hercules from an unusual viewpoint, make indelicate jokes about his hairy bottom. Hercules laughs and lets them go, demonstrating a sense of humor not usually attributed to him. The metopes of Temple C at Selinus are carved in high relief, almost in the round, fitted into panel-like openings under a widely protruding cornice. There are traces of color on a thin layer of stucco. The background is red. Reconstructions in the museum at Palermo reveal cornice blocks with the guttae and the original triglyphs. The strong carving, sided by vivid coloring, brings out the detail of the metope against the shadow of the overhanging cornice. Sculpture and painting come together, a vivid picture book of Greek myths. Three metopes from Selinus, Temple E, built some 60 years later, contemporary with the Olympia sculpture and the emergent severe style, give us three encounters between man and woman. Zeus unveils Hera, or perhaps Hera is unveiling herself before Zeus. The god has taken hold of her arm impatiently. He wants to pull her towards him. His mouth is half open. His teeth show. But the goddess is moved only of her own free will. Yielding, she triumphs. Actaeon the huntsman has, through no fault of his own, surprised Artemis bathing in the river. She throws the skin of a stag over him, and he's torn to pieces by his own hounds. The ever-virginal Artemis punishes Actaeon simply because he has had the misfortune to see her naked. A third metaphor shows Hercules' fight with the Amazon Hippolyta. The hero versus the beautiful warrior queen. There are similar encounters of Theseus and Achilles against Antiope and Penthesilea. Has she fallen in love at the moment of death? She does not ask for mercy. He, on the downward stroke of his sword, might gladly grant her her life, but their eyes meet a fraction too late. Compare the Doric and the Ionic capital. The difference between them is profound, underlined by their different geographical location. Yet both temple styles derive from the same background, at the same point of time. Only Didyma, the most famous oracular shrine of Apollo, and second only to Delphi, can give us some conception of the gigantic temples so characteristic of Ionic building in Asia Minor. Now we have only the ruins of the rebuilt temple, constructed at the time of Alexander the Great on the foundations and after the plan of the earlier one which had been destroyed by the Persians. The double colonnade of 120 columns is surrounded by a walled precinct which contained the cult chamber of Apollo, as well as the sacred spring and laurel grove under the open sky. The proportions of the Ionic temples aim at the gigantic, but also at the light and lofty. The columns of Didyma are over 60 feet high with a diameter of 6 feet at the lower level. By contrast, the columns of the Doric temple of Hera at Paestum were barely 30 feet high, yet had a lower diameter of more than 6 feet. The whole elevation, column, and entablature of Hera's Paestum temple could have been accommodated within the great entrance portal at Didyma. There is no pediment at Didyma. Perhaps none had ever been planned. No triglyphs and metopes, and therefore no angle conflict. Slender columns soar effortlessly, carrying the light entablature. The continuous frieze of carved ornament above the architrave echoes the carved column bases below. Work on this later temple of Didyma was continued over 5 centuries, from Alexander the Great down to the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. It was never finished. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus has left us a few remains and a description or two from ancient writers. Again, there was an earlier temple, burnt down by Herostratus, and a successor to replace it of the same plan and dimensions. Pliny, counting as usual, listed 127 columns and noted that the marble was bluish. Of deeper import, far back in holy isolation under the open sky, great Artemis stood. A later copy gives us an idea of the famous goddess, mistress of the animals, calm-eyed and many-breasted, with a rich mouth. She had her hands then. What was it she held in them, this nurturer of men? The Doric Temple of Zeus at Olympia. The Ionic Temple of Artemis. Its area is greater than that of the biggest Gothic cathedral in Europe. The cella was uncovered. The Ionic Temple confined its sculpture to two places, one just above the column base, where no Doric architect would ever have put it, because there it denied the function of the column as a constructional element. Here is such a piece, life-size relief figures from the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus of the later classical period, and now in the British Museum in London. A woman between Hermes, messenger of the gods, and death personified in Theratos, youth with sword and huge eagle's wings. The other spot for sculpture in the Ionic Temple was the frieze above the architrave. Not many such friezes have survived. One of them that has is archaic, about 20 inches high, from a treasure house in Delphi. Uninterrupted by triglyphs, unconfined by the frame of a metaphy, a band of relief sculpture glows continuously with the battle of the gods against the giants. These magnificent giant temples of the Ionian East inspired imitations in Doric territory. This happened particularly in Sicily, where there was no lack of wealth or space, and the settlers, though of Doric descent, were independent and conscious of their own artisan strength. Selinus was colonized by Megara, the neighboring city of Athens. 7 great temples stood on 2 hills within the city. They were all destroyed by earthquakes, their pillars flung down like a series of proverbial dominoes. What is here seen to be standing was restored in the present century. This enormous mass of ruins, known as Temple G, was sacred to Apollo. Fragments of the entablature of capitals and column drums are all of a size hitherto unheard of for a Doric temple. The Ionic Temple of Apollo at Didyma boasted columns 65 feet high with a lower diameter of 6 feet. Temple G at Selinus was 54 feet high with a lower diameter of 11 feet. The aim of the builders was to achieve the Ionic measure and surpass it. The columns of Temple G were blocked out when they were quarried, 7 miles from the city. Here we can study in detail one of the many technical methods practiced in antiquity. A narrow channel, some 25 to 30 inches broad, was drilled and chiseled into the living limestone. The column drum was thus blocked out, with the tapering of the column taken into account. The drum is over 12 feet high, with a circumference of 36 feet. Later, the drum was disengaged and removed on wooden rollers from the quarry. These columns were, in proportion of height to circumference, the most enormous ever to have been built into a Greek temple. But some of these columns were not even fluted, and because we know that flutes were usually cut only at the final stage, when the column was already standing, we also know that the project was never finished. At another unfinished temple in Segesta, the bosses for attaching pulleys and lifting tackle are still there, for these are not removed until a building is completed. The epidermis, or outer layer, of the stone has not even been cut down to the finished surface. The previous surface served as protective skin against damage during building operations, so the final stage was never reached at all. The propylaeum, or vestibule, of the Athenian Acropolis serves to show that the blocks fit so closely that no binding material was needed. Once the final surface was achieved, stone lay flush on stone. Acragas, the present-day Agrigento, boasted of no fewer than 10 Doric temples, 5 of which lined the city wall. The stone is earthy brown, porous limestone, quarried locally. Its coloring bears no relation to the original appearance of this chain of temples. The stone was once covered in stucco, a luminous white, enlivened with strong, clear colors. There are still traces of the stucco, ground marble dust, which was applied over the surface. Like Selinus, her neighbor city, Acragas aimed at the grandiose and gigantic, eventually outdoing her. The Temple of Zeus at Acragas surpassed Temple G of Selinus in all dimensions. Scattered amongst its ruins were found fragments of Atlantes, that is, naked males who support the structure with bent arms, just as Atlas carried the heavens on his shoulders. 38 Atlantes, each 27 feet tall, stood in the recesses between the columns. It is believed that many thousands of Carthaginian prisoners taken in 480 BC at the Battle of Himera were forced to work on this temple, and that the Atlas figures symbolized them. This temple was a victory monument. It was still unfinished when 75 years later the Carthaginians took Acragas and destroyed it. Earthquakes completed the ruin. Capitals found amongst the ruins of the temple show that the columns were really half columns, though of enormous size, abutting against a solid wall. Here's one of the capitals. At the bottom of the column, a man could have stood comfortably within the concave recess of one flute. The building must have looked something like this. However, since the height and other details are unknown, reconstruction must remain largely hypothetical. The form of the temple is Doric, yet many of its characteristics are the very opposite in nature. The Parthenon. The temple of Athena Parthenos on the Acropolis of Athens. It had remained virtually unharmed for 2,000 years. It served as a church in early Christian times, and then as a mosque under the Turks. During the siege by the Venetians under Morosini, the greatest disaster occurred. On the 26th of September in 1687, the temple, which was being used by the Turks as a powder magazine, was hit by the cannon shot of a German master gunner from Lüneburg. Fortunately, just before this catastrophe, Jacques Carré, a painter traveling in the suite of a French diplomat, had the opportunity to see the pedimental figures and to draw them. In the west pediment, he records that he saw 20 figures in addition to the horses. Of these, only fragments remain. The only originals left on the temple itself are a male and a female torso. They are Cecrops, the legendary first king of Athens, and his daughter Pandrosos. They cling to each other as though for shelter against the storms of 2.5 millennia. The figures now on the east pediment are modern casts in concrete from the originals in London, where they were taken by Lord Elgin in 1600. In the left corner of the pediment, the 4-horse chariot of Helios, the sun god, rises from the horizon. What imaginative audacity to burst through those triangular fetters. A reclining male figure turns toward the rising sun. Some say it is Hercules, others Dionysus. The group of 3 goddesses turns toward the center of the pediment, where was shown, according to Pausanias, the birth of Athena. At the opposite end of the pediment, the moon goddess in her chariot is disappearing into the ocean. Night gives way to dawn at Athena's miraculous birth. The pediments here are reserved for the gods. The 92 metopes which proceed along the entablature right around the temple are a picture book of the great mythical battles. The splendor of the Pentelic marble should not make us forget that both entablature and pediments were once picked out in color. Nor need we assume that this modern representation is too fanciful. Here, lapiths fight centaurs. We met the theme already on the west pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. The fight is divided into separate incidents. Men matched against horsemen in ever-varying studies of combat. High up on the wall of the cella, taking in the porch in front as well as the chamber in the rear, ran a continuous ionic frieze. It was some 175 yards long and a little more than 1 yard high. No direct sunlight ever shone on it, for it was placed immediately below the paneled ceiling of the colonnaded aisle. Now, with the ceiling gone, it is exposed to bright sunlight. But originally, it must have been visible only in dim shadow. The festival of the Panathenaea was celebrated every 4 years. The Olympians, the blessed ones who enjoy watching the struggles of mortals, are shown here relaxed in their chairs. Ares, the god of war, a little bored, clasps his knees. Hera lifts her veil to Zeus. Maidens bring up chairs, a symbolic invitation to the gods, who in fact are already seated and attending, unseen by mortal eyes. The peplos, the robe for the statue of Athena, is being unfolded. Athena, in whose honor the festival is celebrated, is seated next to Hephaestus, the lame god of the forge. The Athenians love to join them in a certain intimacy. Apollo engages in conversation with the young Poseidon of the dark locks. Apollo's sister Artemis, the unapproachable huntress, is here relaxed and gentle. Human beings, headed by sacrificial animals and offerings to the gods, proceed along both sides of the cella. If it is true that here art sees man on an idealized, abstract level of existence, then it's true also of animals. The four-horse teams here on parade take part in special races. 400 men and 200 animals fill this frieze. And now the cavalcade of horsemen. No saddles for them, no spurs, nor stirrups, only reins. Perfection of horsemanship, and perhaps symbolic of a growth in this culture's consciousness. The procession, which started at dawn, is already well advanced. But at the starting point, some stragglers are still busy with the last-minute preparations. A cloak is girded, the waiting horses scratch the ground impatiently and rear up. The surrounding frieze has been taken from the Ionic temple. The broadening of the cella to a central space is also Ionic influence. The center aisle, 36 feet wide, could span nothing heavier than a wooden ceiling. The two-storied interior colonnade runs on three sides round the statue of the goddess. This is the Athena Parthenos by Phidias, 40 feet high, of gold and ivory on a wooden frame. A small-scale marble copy of the Roman period supplements the descriptions of ancient writers. The color and light effects in that room cannot be told, only implied, only imagined. In buildings on the Acropolis, the Propylaea, the Nike Temple, the Erechtheion, we can see the synthesis of the Ionic and Doric spirits in the age of Pericles, where the two great architectural forms stand side by side. It's not the gigantic measurement, but the elegance of the Ionic style, the slim, high-reaching, decorative game matched to Doric sternness. In this partnership, the Parthenon appears as the last refined perfection of the Doric style. Tension that lies in rejection of straight lines fills the entire building. The vertical leans inward, measurably should the eye think it is deceived. The perspective of the tightly knit colonnade is emphasized at the corners. The horizontal curves slightly upwards, some 4 inches in 80 yards, even into the entablature. The artists of that time handled the pedantic problems and difficult proportions of the Doric order with masterly consequential virtuosity. At Bassae, deep in the mountains of Arcady, the remote and legendary heart of the Peloponnese, a temple lies by a spring sacred to Apollo Epicurus, the Holy One. Pausanias notes that Iktinos, who built the Parthenon, was the architect of this temple, too. The rather conventional Doric exterior hides a quite revolutionary solution to the problem of the inner space of the cella. Throughout, Ionic columns with unusual Ionic capitals and unusual column bases are attached to the inside walls by short spurs. Here, Greek artists created the first covered inner space with an architectural facade. An Ionic entablature with a sculptured frieze runs above the capitals of the interior colonnade. The exterior of a temple has been turned into the interior. The experiment is rounded off by what is thought to be the earliest known Corinthian capital, as a single central column in the background. The only source of light came through the door. The sculptured frieze must have been in semi-darkness, hovering over visitants to the awesome room. The subject of the frieze is the Battle of the Amazons. The physical contrast between male and female, strenuously engaged in combat, had always been attractive to Greek artists. The difference between men and women is made much of at every turn. A fallen Amazon, no less the warrior, plainly wishes to discuss with her vanquisher whether the coup de grace is really necessary. The frieze is 10 inches high. Its background is colored blue, bare skin and light tones, garments and armor in red, green, violet, weapons in metal bronze. An Amazon with a mortally wounded comrade in their arms. These young women acted in battle as if they were indeed men. An Amazon stops her comrade from killing a fallen opponent. What had once been taken for granted is now questioned. There's something more between friend and foe than merely the will to kill. Such gestures of pity and mercy had not been seen before in Greek sculpture. Without any clear dividing mark, the battle of Amazons and Greeks turns into a violent brawl between Lapiths and the drunken centaurs. A famous artist of his time, the Corinthian sculptor Callimachus, is said to have noticed an acanthus plant, which had grown and completely enveloped a basket of flowers left resting on a stone. He saw it, so the story goes, and invented the Corinthian capital. It sits on a slender, tall, Ionic column with deep flutes like a bud on a stalk. Decorative and magnificent from every angle, it replaced the Ionic capital. The monolithic columns of the archaic Doric temple seem to carry their load like a living organism growing from the very earth. The Corinthian column, created for love of the magnificent and grandiose, so characteristic of Hellenistic and Roman architecture, could meet every need, for a gigantic column or the most delicate of pilasters. The interior of the Roman temple at Baalbek in Syria had its ancestor in the cella of Baassé, and the inimitable pillars of Greece have passed on to their descendants, however remote from origin, something that lingers architecturally in the Baroque facade of the 17th century, in the occasional 19th century copies, in some of our own modern love of the leaning line and the simple curve. We, too, of this century, love great flowerings in art. We are ourselves proper descendants of so grand a beginning.